Good morning. I'm Starnes Walker. I serve as a member of our Homeland Security Experts Group, and it's my privilege to introduce our moderator for this plenary session entitled Policing Reform. So welcome, and glad you can be here today with us. Our moderator is Cathy Lanier. She brings an impressive 26 years of law enforcement and counterterrorism experience to the table. Cathy now serves as a member also of our Homeland Security Experts Group and also is the Senior Vice President and Chief of Security of the National Football League. Prior to that, she served as the Chief of Police of Washington, D.C. So again, let's thank Cathy for being here, and she also serves as a member of our Homeland Security Experts Group.
Good morning. I'm going to start with a little history before I introduce our panel. In 1989, in the height of the crack cocaine epidemic in Washington, D.C., we were known as the murder capital of the world. The chief of police was under pressure with a lot of retirements from the mass hire 20 years earlier, following the 1968 riots, to increase the size of our department by 1,000 in the course of 2 years. The chief of police accomplished that goal. The recruiting process, of course, and the background process was cut short, as was the police academy. I was hired during that mass hire in September of 1990, along with 700 others that year. In March of 1991, we all watched in horror as the Rodney King incident unfolded. In May of 1991, in Washington, D.C., a rookie officer just out of the academy, 2 weeks ahead of me, shot an armed man actually, who was being arrested for possession of an open container of alcohol following Cinco de Mayo in Mount Pleasant. 7 days of riots followed that police shooting. In 1995, the city of Washington, D.C. was nearly bankrupt. The city was put into financial receivership, and the Financial Control Board was put in charge of the city. By 1997, all of the senior officers and officials from the Metropolitan Police Department had retired, and we had a very young, inexperienced force. After 6 years on the job of studying promotional exams and criminal justice classes at UDC, I was now a lieutenant on the Metropolitan Police Department. I was in charge, with 6 years on, of the entire night shift of a patrol district. That same year, I was appointed to a group called, affectionately, the G21, the Group of 21. There was 21 members of our department that were appointed to work on a reform group with Booz Allen and Hamilton that was brought in by the Financial Control Board. In 1998, the Washington Post ran a series of 5 articles that ultimately won a Pulitzer Prize that highlighted that the D.C. Police Department shot and killed more people per capita in the 1990s than any other large American police force. John Miller, you're not on mute.
Sorry.
We love you, John.
Let me find that mute thing.
Yeah,
There you go.
okay. It's his first Zoom. You have to forgive him. Following that series of articles, our newly appointed Chief of Police, Chuck Ramsey, invited DOJ to come into our department and assist us with the reforms that, some of which had been started with the Booz Allen Group. By this time, I was a commanding officer of Major Narcotics Branch. I spent the next 6 years of my time in the department on those reforms. How we got to the place as a department were very clear. We lacked funding. The city was broken financially. We didn't have equipment. Our only weapon to defend ourselves was our firearms. We had no less lethal weapons, and there were plenty available. We lacked training. There wasn't enough overtime to send officers back to the range to requalify or to qualify with any less lethal weapons, so training was almost non-existent. There were certainly outdated policies that hadn't been updated since the early 70s, a lack of leadership, and clearly a lack of accountability and transparency. As a part of those reform efforts, I also served as the Use of Force Review Board Chairman for 6 years. My role in that position, we reviewed every single discharge of a firearm by a Metropolitan police officer and every single serious use of force. Having spent 5 years as the SOD commander, I also served as the department's 30B6 witness, or expert witness, for all protests, civil disturbances, and mass arrests for 6 years. In 2007, I became the chief of police. In 2008, we were released from our MOA, or Memorandum of Agreement with the Department of Justice. It was supposed to be a 5-year agreement. It ended up being much longer. And in 2016, an independent consultant, a former DOJ attorney, was hired by the City Council to come back to MPD and review our reforms 15 years after we implemented them to see if we had, in fact, maintained those reforms. Fortunately, those reforms were reviewed and we were still intact, and we had no problems with our use of force. In my time as the chief of police, we averaged 3 fatal police shootings a year. We averaged 658,000 911 calls for service each year. We recovered more than 2,000 illegal firearms each year and executed hundreds of search and arrest warrants. Reform is possible, but it is not universally needed. There are many police departments that are in the same place that the Metropolitan Police Department were, and many that are in the same place that the Metropolitan Police Department is. Reform is possible, and it almost always involves the same issues that were identified in the Metropolitan Police Department back in 1998. But reform and policy must be based on factual data, and that, unfortunately, in many police departments is lacking. They either don't collect or don't share that information. So I'm going to rely on the experts on this panel today to identify what police reform means and where we can put our efforts to most effectively fix what needs to be fixed and restore the nation's confidence in our law enforcement. And we need to do that as quickly as possible. I've had the privilege to meet and work with and learn from all of the panel members here over the past 27 years. I'll do a brief introduction and we'll start with our questions. Roseanna Ander, who joins me on stage, is the Executive Director of the University of Chicago Crime and Education Lab. Ms. Ander has also served as the Illinois Juvenile Justice Commission and also public safety transition teams for both Chicago Mayor Rahm Emanuel and Illinois Governor Bruce Rauner. Chief Erica Shields, Chief of Police currently in Louisville Metropolitan Police Department. Say that right, Louisville Metropolitan Police Department. Louisville, thank you. She began her career in Atlanta, Georgia in 1995 as a patrol officer and eventually became the Chief of Police in Atlanta. Chief Shields is a strong advocate for 21st century policing and has been an outspoken leader on police reform. John Miller, despite his failure to understand the mute button on his Zoom, Deputy Commissioner of Intelligence and Counterterrorism in the NYPD. He has also served as the Deputy Director of the Intelligence and Analysis Division at the ODNI, Officer Director of National Intelligence, the Assistant Director of the FBI, the Commanding Officer of Counterterrorism and Criminal Intelligence with the Los Angeles Police Department. Along with his service in law enforcement and intelligence, Deputy Commissioner Miller was also a journalist and an author, best known for his interview with terrorist leader Osama bin Laden. And then lastly, Chuck Wexler, the Executive Director of the Police Executive Research Forum, PERF, as we call them, a research organization dedicated to improving the professionalism of policing. In 2016, under Mr. Wexler's leadership, the Police Executive Research Forum produced a set of 30 guiding principles on use of force, based in part on PERF's work in Scotland, where most police officers do not carry firearms, but have been trained in sophisticated de-escalation skills. PERF then developed a training program to implement the guiding principles in police agencies nationwide, and the New Jersey Attorney General recently mandated that all 38,000 police officers in the state receive it in 2021. So Roseanna, we'll start with you. Talk to me about your work with the Chicago Crime Lab and the evidence around the impact of police reform and consent decrees.
Great. Well, thanks so much for having me, and it's great to be with such incredible people here on the stage and on video. The University of Chicago Crime Lab really started because of a crisis in Chicago. We were having a lot of gun violence happening, and we recognized that a place like the University of Chicago had tremendous resources, but too often those resources were not being brought to bear to solve some of the most urgent and pressing challenges on the ground in our home city of Chicago. What good are all those Nobel Prize winners if they won't walk 2 blocks to the south or 2 blocks to the west to make a difference in their home city? So we wanted to directly engage with government, because government is both in many ways the problem, if you look at the failures of government, but also the only way to a scalable solution. So in our home city, we started with public safety, the thing that was most socially costly and having the greatest impact. So we've worked with the Chicago Police Department and other police departments to try to be a partner in innovation. We don't have the answers, but we think that we can work together to innovate and use data and evidence to try to drive solutions. I think one of the sort of questions for the panel today is, what is police reform? And I think we need to actually step back and say, what is the job of police? I think there is not consensus on what it is that we are expecting our police officers to do. If you just look at the 911 calls that come in and the broad array of things that residents are asking their government for, and that we are then asking police to do, I think there's a real mismatch between all that they're being asked to do, and as you pointed out, the training that they get, the tools that they get, the resources that they have, the accountability systems, how we are identifying the people who should become leaders in policing. And so I think there's just a lot of work to be done, and we haven't really generated the kind of data and evidence that we need to make sure that we have world-class policing in every town, in every city, in every state in this country.
So you've also looked at the intersection of the most recent spike in violent crime and reform efforts that are going on. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think everybody wants a simple answer. Well, why is violent crime up? And if you're on the left, you have one view. If you're on the right, you have another view.
Of course.
And I think the truth is it's incredibly nuanced, and it's a lot of things that are sort of acting collectively. And I think that as we talk about police reform, I think we really need to understand. We need to be looking at how do we improve the quality of policing at the same time that we don't lose sight of the gun violence that's happening in cities. And I think often people are looking at one side of the ledger or the other, and we can't have both. We can have better, more effective policing and less gun violence, but we need to be very, very intentional in how we do that. And I think the pandemic certainly had an impact on gun violence for lots of reasons. People were stuck in their homes, there was more stress, lots of things. And there was social unrest, and people were questioning the legitimacy of police. And I think people think of, did the police pull back? Did residents stop coming forward? I think it's a little bit of both. And a lot of other things in a once-in-a-century pandemic that were all sort of combining to create this unfortunate and very vicious cycle. But I think the people who say it's just sort of police going fetal, or it's the movement for social justice, I think that's sort of way oversimplifying a very complex phenomenon.
Sure. So I know Erica's going to talk a little bit about the communities, what's happening in communities and violent crime, and then what the communities are looking for from the police a little bit later. But thank you. So John, you got your mute button off, buddy? I just need to hear your voice.
There we go.
There you go. You look good, John.
I got all messed up for this.
John, can you talk a little bit about when you see the videos of the shootings that we have seen over the past 3 years, I'd say, of the shootings that have been, viral, broadcast over and over and over again, the shootings that, kind of horrify, not just police shootings, but those incidents that you see that horrify us when we see uses of deadly force by police. Tell me what your thoughts are.
So my first thought is that you see those videos, and as you pointed out, Cathy, they get played again and again and again and again on social media. They get millions of hits on television news. They become part of this endless drumbeat, and that has an effect right there. The effect it has is because they're inundative, that the public gets the idea that the very small number of encounters that involve police officers shooting somebody or a serious use of force they get the idea that these are all too common because they see these things all the time. The one thing I think in terms of themes, Cathy, that comes up in these videos again and again is you see a shooting that every incident is unique, so that's the caveat, but you see a shooting that is probably legally justified. That's why these prosecutions face such challenges in court. But when you rewind the circumstances in that video, the constant theme is, and George Floyd is not one of those cases. It's the cases in these fast-paced things that get away from the officers. The constant theme is, what were the options that they passed by that caused them to be involved in, yes, a legally justifiable shooting, but a shooting that didn't have to happen because they went by the ability to slow the incident down, to back up and call for special equipment and other officers with different training. That is the constant theme that we see from those videos.
How did we get ourselves in that spot, right?
Exactly.
The old adage was, you know, a car fleeing from police and another officer steps in front of the car and then shoots because the car has now presented a threat to the officer instead of stepping behind cover and not in front of the car. So it is training, right? The ability to train and have adequate policy.
It is, but I also think that the presence of the body cameras and the value of the videos is unspeakably positive. In the NYPD experience, it was like anywhere else. First, the department resisted being an early adopter of body cameras just because it was not a heavy lift, it was an enormous lift. Where do you get 36,000 body cameras and pay for it and work out a storage policy and make sure that they actually work and function? So it was the kind of thing you always said, well, we'll do that tomorrow because it's just too big. When the department was pushed into it by a federal monitor, first, this is natural, right? The cops didn't want to wear them. They didn't want to be spied on. They didn't want somebody looking over their shoulder, literally, actually in front of their shoulder. We had to do kind of a lot of psychology there saying, look, you know, people make allegations against police officers all the time. Remember, the camera is facing out. It's what you're seeing. Everybody else is already holding up a phone and videotaping you all the time, especially when it gets dicey. And yet, you know, it was hard to get them to adopt it. And like every other police department that has been through the throes of the same, you know, emotional roller coaster on the part of police officers saying, it's just one more layer of somebody watching my every move. Now it's very hard to get the officers to leave without a body camera, because what have the effects been? The effects have been civilian complaints have gone down. And that's because you can't just make a complaint and say the cop did or said X because you're mad at them or the outcome of your encounter, because you now know this whole thing was on tape, including what you said and did. The more interesting phenomenon is, while complaints to the Civilian Complaint Review Board have gone down, convictions of officers and definitive findings have gone up. So we're seeing less cases go unsubstantiated, because there's the movie version of it now. We're also seeing an uptick in findings that the complaint is substantiated. And in lots of cases, we're getting these exonerations because it's the tail of the tape. It just didn't happen. So I think that has given officers confidence. But the lessons we take from it just go back to the how did you get yourself in that position piece. We've watched a number of videos where you see not only the officer's point of view, but the body cameras of all the other officers who are on the scene, the officers who are around them, what occurs. And, you know, we recently issued every patrol car a set of wooden chocks attached to a rope so that they could tie off the door. So many of our biggest challenges have been, they came to the door flew open, the person displayed a knife, you know, you end up in that shooting in some narrow hallway. How about when the report is the person has a weapon and they're not letting you in to tie off the door with the rope, and now you have control of the door? A rope and a triangular piece of wood is not a giant piece of technology, but it has been game-changing in a number of incidents because again, when you're trying to exercise all your options before you get to deadly force, as opposed to pass them by and then end up in a point of no return, a rope and a chock of wood is pretty good.
And a lot easier to use than that mute button, too.
Yeah, that too. I mean, it's the kind of low-tech thing that would be good for me.
You know, I really shouldn't joke. You're absolutely right, John. And this, I've seen it play out over and over again. And when we implemented body cameras, it was such an excellent training tool to look at how officers were getting themselves in tactical situations and how do we, do our training a little bit differently. It really gave us a great new perspective. So Erica, can you talk to us a little bit? You've policed now in 2 different communities, and you're an outsider coming in Louisville, and there's been some controversial police-involved shootings there, and so you're trying to really restore that trust in the community. Talk to me about what, the feeling of the community is. A lot of people think that communities don't want policing them in their communities anymore, and I don't know that that's what you see and hear in a lot of communities.
Right, and good morning. I really enjoyed listening to all of this, including the panel previous. So I got into Louisville in January of 2021. And of course, Breonna Taylor was through the second half, March of 2020, went public when George Floyd did, and went through the end of the year 2020. But also predating that, there'd been several high-profile traffic stops by LMPD, Louisville Metro Police Department, in 2019 against Black motorists. And rather than isolating the behaviors of the officers, retraining them, redefining policy, there was more of a posture, don't do traffic, don't be proactive. And so when I come in here, what I find is I have a department that is reluctant to police. We're not self-initiating anything. The community is still, the tension is just palpable. And what I recognized was, even though in my mind, I knew how I could come in and immediately start hitting at the homicides and the violent crime and tackling it, because I've learned and done enough in Atlanta that worked. What I recognized was, 1, I had to ensure the officers could execute on it appropriately, and 2, even the slightest perceived misstep would potentially implode this city. So my posture here has been very, very deliberate, very methodical. And what I'll say to you is, I'm in a city that's not New York City size, obviously. I have 142 homicides. 75% of them are African-American, and 85% of them are male. So those individuals who are in the already marginalized communities are the victims. They are the homicide victims. And this is the community that most desperately needs the presence of police. And yet this is the community that, if we're to believe the narrative of the folks who are out front, is that they don't want the police. And I disagree with that. I think what I always heard my whole career, and I came from Atlanta where the population was around 55% African-American, was the communities that are having to endure violent crime day in and day out do want the police. They always are asking for more police. It's how do we police? And the risk that you run when you get into this narrative of, well, we don't need police, I can tell you, your white communities that are middle income upward are going to figure out a way to fund private police. The marginalized communities are the ones who are going to be defunded. And you need to look no closer than what's going on in Atlanta right now. The north end of the city that is extremely affluent wants to create its own city, just because they wants to cut off from the rest of the city because crime is rampant. So I think it's really important, as the prior panelists on here have all touched on, is you have to be you have to use data, you have to be deliberate in how we move forward. Do not let emotion drive our decision making, because at the end of the day, the people who are going to be most impacted by police, and I am living it day in and day out, that the people who have been most impacted by police not being proactive is the Black community. And yes, there's a lot of factors that have played out, but what I can tell you is the issues and the crime in the Black community were there long before COVID. And what you're seeing really across the US from many of these cities when you talk to other chiefs is there's a very real reluctance by police to engage and be proactive, whether they feel they can't, they don't know how to. And so I think we have to just be very, very thoughtful in how we move this forward, or it's gonna really impact some communities much, much harder than others.
Totally agree. Totally agree. Great job what you're doing out there, Eric. I appreciate you being with us. I know you're very busy. Chuck, you've spent a lot of time. I've learned so much from you over the years. You've spent a lot of time pulling together research and bringing in non-traditional partners to work with law enforcement and help us resolve issue after issue after issue. You were ahead of everybody else back in 2016 with bringing in the police from Scotland to talk about de-escalation and how it is that they can police communities with no firearms and successfully deal with the same things that we deal with here, extreme mental health challenges out in the community and violence. So just a couple other things that I want you to speak about. One is, we talk about there's really a lack of data and a lack of transparency. There really is no good numbers universally across all 18,000 police departments in the United States. So for us to say, what the problem is in use of force, it's very difficult to pinpoint without that data. But there is some good data out there, and we should use probably what's there. So can you talk about that, and then your efforts historically to successfully push police reform over the last couple of decades that have worked? So kind of share those thoughts with us.
Well, thanks, Cathy, and thanks for your leadership for a number of years. It's interesting, people will say, you need accurate data, but sometimes there's things you can do with what you've got. I think I want to mention the NYPD. I want to mention 50 years ago, 1972, the NYPD shot at about 950 people a year. You can get your head around that figure, 950 people a year. They didn't kill 950 people, but maybe about 40 or 50, or 70 actually. But they realized one part of that 950 was shooting at cars. And by implementing that one policy, and remember that's 50 years ago, within 2 years they cut that number to 450. And like you mentioned, Cathy, the reason people would shoot at cars, they put themselves in a position where they would either get hurt or have no choice but to shoot at the car. And so New York did that. So policy matters, leadership matters. And then I would skip to what you were talking about, Cathy, in Washington, D.C., which was, as you said, the Washington Post would win a Pulitzer for the deadliest police department in the country. And under your leadership and Chuck Ramsey's leadership, that they re-engineered 20 years ago use of force. So Washington, D.C. now has one of the lowest rates of use of force. And so, people will say, we don't have enough data, but there's a lot of things you can do. Leadership matters, policy matters. And yeah, you're right. I was in Scotland during, the period in 2016 when all of the things were going on back here. And, just as you're watching, I was talking to a recruit in Scotland. I said, well, how do you deal with people with knives? Because they don't have guns. And he proceeded to walk me through it. And then I came back here realizing that if I told people in the United States, this is what they do in Scotland, no one would want to do it. But what I thought of? Was the NYPD Emergency Service Unit. And John Miller certainly knows a lot about that. And, I told then Commissioner Bill Bratton, I said, I want our guards to spend 5 days with the Emergency Service Unit. And basically they were doing what I saw in Scotland. They were slowing things down using time and distance. And we spent time with them and we still work with them. And out of that came ICAT training, Integrated Communication Assessment Tactics, which is all a fancy word for slowing things down using time and distance. The Washington Post would win a second Pulitzer Prize on use of deadly force when they broke down 1,000 officer-involved shootings. Of that 1,000, 60% involved guns. So you'll never see a controversy on TV when a suspect has a gun and a police officer faces that suspect with a gun. Really, it never happens. However, it's that 40%, it's roughly 400 a year, that involve people with mental health issues, people with knives, people with 2x4s, people who the police thought had a gun. That 400, that 40%, we believe can make a difference. And that is what ICAT tries to impact. So as you started this all up about social media and the visions of police-involved shootings, it's the ones that get police in trouble are that 40%. When you're dealing with someone who's autistic and they don't listen to orders, or you have a homeless person and a cop kicks a homeless person. And as John Timoney used to say, homeless people carry knives to protect themselves, not to hurt someone. So if you don't know that, so all of that came into ICAT training, and I want to recognize Erica Shields because Louisville implemented ICAT training. Now, here's what's really interesting, talking about data. Robin Engel from the University of Cincinnati evaluated the ICAT training in Louisville in a randomized control study, the gold standard, and it reduced use of force incidents by 26%, citizen injuries by 26%. And here's the kicker, because everybody said PERF was going to get cops killed, 36% reduction in officer injuries. So it was good for everybody. So all of that is to say, there's things we can do in the short term and there's things we can do in the long term. But, we don't have to wait for all the data to come in to do things now.
Thank you, Chuck. I would say, if you just think about what you highlighted there, training is such a critical part, but also policy, and this comes to the leadership. When police budgets get cut, the first thing that goes is your civilian staff. Your civilian staff are the ones that push the policy development, make sure those policies are written. And if you don't have policies that say you can't use neck restraint, right? And if you do use a neck restraint, you're going to be disciplined and potentially could be fired if somebody's injured in the use of a neck restraint. I talk about George Floyd, right? So if you fire at a moving vehicle, there's a policy against that. You're trained against that. If you don't have those things, you're at a disadvantage. And there has to be accountability and discipline when people violate the policy. And Chuck, I just want to touch on briefly with you. You tell this great story of my predecessor, Chuck Ramsey, with the ticking time bomb. There are challenges to what police leadership has done and tries to do in police reform. Can you talk about what those challenges are?
Well, biggest challenge. I think, first of all, I think you need to train cops to hold them accountable. I think one of the issues when, the media calls and asks, why did the cop do what they did? I usually say the cop did what they did because that's how they're trained. So if you don't train them, you don't have a policy that says don't shoot at cars that is ironclad, and a cop shoots at a car. If you don't have a policy, it's hard to hold a cop accountable. However, there are cops that are frequent flyers that get involved over and over again. So if you don't have an early warning system to identify them, you're going to have a problem. And as a matter of fact, what the consent decrees do, that's one of the first things they do. You have to implement that. But having said that, even trying to fire a cop that's been involved over and over again with the strong labor we have is challenging. But I think, look at what John Timoney did in Miami. When he got to Miami, he identified the cops that were shooting people. What did he do? He took them off the street, and they went for he always used to correct me because I'd get it wrong, 29 months without shooting anyone. So get the cops who are shooting people off the street. That doesn't take much.
Yep. So there are challenges when you're trying to do police reform, and as the chief of police in Washington, D.C., I fired bad cops. We had policies, they violated those policies. If they were frequent flyers, like Chuck talked about, we would fire those officers. A good number of those officers were rehired because of the police unions, and the police unions finding small administrative holes in the process to get those officers rehired. So as the chief of police, most police chiefs have challenges. They are not the final say in termination of officers that are involved in misconduct and sometimes serious and multiple uses of force. So we're coming down to the end of time, and I know we'll have some questions from the audience, but I just want to kind of wrap up with a couple of things. One, I suggest that we learn from our past this time. There's a lot of things happening right now that are cyclical. It's happened before. We're coming through the same cycle again. I suggest we learn from our past and separate ourselves from the divisive rhetoric and focus our efforts on the reform that makes sense, rather than policies that are not supported by any kind of data or evidence. Otherwise, our reform efforts are going to fail. We should be thinking about the short and long-term strategies that Chuck mentioned. Thoughtful, tactical response. Let's act on what we know now. We know what strong policies and good training and equipment can do. It's counter to the defund movement, but it is based in long-term evidence. And then the longer-term strategic plan. Why aren't there reporting requirements from every single police department in this country? Why isn't every police department in this country reporting on their use of force? And transparency, tracking that use of force and analyzing what we know about those uses of force so that we can base reforms on real information. I think there has to be consistent policies, penalties, accountability, and transparency. That's the bottom line for every agency, no matter how large or small. We're in a dangerous place. There's a mass exodus of police officers going on at the same time where we're in a retirement bubble nationwide. Every 20, 25 years, we have this big exodus of police officers that potentially could happen, and now it's been accelerated because of what's happening. There's a lack of ability to recruit. Every one of these law enforcement people here will tell you it's very, very difficult to recruit a police officer today. And then there's a lack of trust in those that are left behind to go and police these communities. This is the perfect storm. You heard the last panel. Domestic violent extremism, targeted violence is the biggest threat we face in our communities today. And these law enforcement officers, especially at the state and local level, are the first line of detection and the first line of defense. And if people don't trust them, we're not going to get the information that we need, and we're not going to be able to defend our communities. So with that, I will take question. All right. Any questions for the panel? No questions?
Can I say something?
Yes.
Just, while we're waiting for a question, I think one of the most important things that can happen at the national level is to really try to understand the lessons from all of the consent decrees that have been implemented before. I think there's a lot of well-intentioned things in there. Some of them have made police departments better. Some of them have had adverse impacts. And to your point about learning from the past, I think we really need to be solving real problems in the real world and not just box checking. And I think some of the time the consent decrees become about box checking to get out from under the consent decree. And I think we really, the DOJ, I would urge them to have some sort of a commission to look at what is all the evidence from all of the different consent decrees, so that going forward we can take what's best, what's working, and help police departments really become 21st century police departments.
All right. So since we are short on time, no questions. We will. Oh yes, we have one here.
Hello, great session, thank you. Henry Willis with Rand Corporation. I have a question. If you could try to connect the two sessions we just had, and we had the law enforcement perspective here. Could you talk a bit about the discussions of white supremacy groups or ideologies in the law enforcement community, and what we know about it and what we need to do about it, if at all?
So I think the divisiveness from my perspective, and I would ask Erica or John to weigh in as well. From my perspective, the divisiveness that we're seeing across America is happening inside of police departments as well. Yes, are there people inside of police departments that have been kind of co-opted to one set of views or into some of these extremist views? I believe there absolutely are. I mean, the Blue Lives Matter movement has been growing, and some of that Blue Lives Matter movement, I think, has been kind of pulled into those extreme views. And this is something that police chiefs and police managers are looking very closely at. It also goes back to kind of good leadership, good management, and people paying attention to what's happening inside their police force. And then how are you going to deal with that? And I also agree with the previous panel that having appreciation for other people's opinion is the first step. Recognizing that you have these things going on in your department is an important part, but you have to start with empathy for that person's position, because the way they feel is the way they feel. So you have to start there and then deal with it from there. But I'll open to John or Erica if either of you have some thoughts on that and the crossover with January 6th.
Just briefly, I'll just say that, I echo everything you say, Cathy. We really try to drill down our employees' social media to make sure that there's not anything there. I think the bigger challenge that I see is it's the same thing you see in the United States. It's depending on where someone is standing, how they view the comment. And so it's not like there's a bright line. And those are the situations that are difficult to manage. I mean, if someone just says something blatantly racist or out there, sure, you fire them. But how about if it's the politics of the day? And that's much harder to weed out, and that's much more commonplace, but I think the end result is just as damaging. John?
So I would say that that's something we took a hard look at. And if you had asked me before January 6th, where are the largest, number of, people who are going to get locked up and charged with that going to come from, I would have said, out in the Midwest, maybe over here or over there, no closer than Pennsylvania, maybe to New York. And yet, New York's FBI office has had the largest number of complaints, indictments, and charges for people involved in the storming of the Capitol, where federal crimes were committed. So that took us aback. One thing that was a great relief is, there were no active duty members of the NYPD in that crowd, and that's something we took an immediate look at. I think that in terms of white supremacy, neo-Nazi groups, we have really imbued into our recruiting, just as you said, Chief Shields, which is, what is your social media? Let's go through all of that. But we've also told our recruiters, what are the actual signs? What are the actual tattoos? What are the actual images and code pieces that go with that, so that they have a finer eye towards a new candidate to make sure that's not coming in. I also think, in terms of that movement vis-a-vis law enforcement, the image of police officers being assaulted and beaten in Washington, D.C., Capitol Police, D.C. Metro cops struggling with these people. If it wasn't, it certainly should have been a turnoff to anybody in law enforcement who would think of joining a movement like that before because of some political ideology. It just goes to show, if you are viewing yourself as, that line between mayhem and safety in America, then you can't be on that side of that group, because they made it clear that they are willing to cross that line no matter who they have to beat up or go through. I thought they truly revealed themselves on that day to cops who might have had some inkling that that was something that they would or could be a part of. We'll certainly keep looking for it. We'll certainly keep finding it. I know it's been an issue in the military, but it is completely intolerable within law enforcement.
Yep. Erica, Chuck, John, and certainly Roseanna, thank you so much for being part of this panel today. I know you all have a lot on your plate and a lot going on. Thank you so much, and great panel.